You are now watching Zach Lesage PTCG. Let's get it! Yo, what's poppin' YouTube? Welcome back to the channel, and it's another Monday, so you know what that means. We're going to be going over the top 10 best decks. This one, we're going to be going over the top 10 best decks heading into May, and I'm super excited to show you exactly what's going on with this list. I spent all morning calculating results from all the events that happened from April 26th to May 2nd, and this is what we got going on in this list today. So no surprises or anything, but there is going to be a little bit of a shakeup in the metagame. I mean, if you've been playing any online events, I'm sure you've noticed it. So that's what we got going on for this video today. We'll see exactly what's going on there. Now, if you're missing any of the cards for these decks, go to ptcgostore.com, plug in code ZLesage5 to save 5% on your next order of codes. That's going to help you build any of these decks. And if you're like, you want to know what, I'm taking a little bit of break from standard, online events suck right now, or maybe I'll play after the Players Cup. If you're looking for some chilling rain codes, they'll definitely have a lot of great codes and deals going on, so stay tuned for that and save that discount code for later, although you could use it every single time that you check out on the website. So if that being said, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button right there. Totally would appreciate it. We recently just hit over 3,500 subs, and we're currently on our way to 4,000 as our next stop, on the way to the moon. So let's see exactly how that goes. Give this video a like to signal boost it to the Pokemon masses. And yeah, let's jump into this video, see exactly what's going on. Jumping into our number 10 spot, we have TempoZard. Now, TempoZard, it was previously number 6, it's number 10, and I don't necessarily have a great explanation for it. I don't know if it's necessarily top players choosing not to play this deck, or other players interested in playing other decks, but basically this seems like a combination of the players who are playing it are doing decently enough to have it in the top 10 decks. I mean, making the top 10 decks list is in and itself an accomplishment, but it doesn't seem like the whole community is really on board with this deck. They're really trying out other things at this time, and that might just be because this deck is not as inherently strong as other decks in a best of one format. For those of you who are wondering how this deck works off using Jirachi Stellar Wish in order to have a consistent backbone to the deck to search out your trainer cards as necessary. Read that as you basically need Welder, which attaches 2 fire energies and draws 3 cards to power up your Pokemon. You could choose between Cramorant, Blacephalon, and Reshiram and Charizard GX to attack your opponent effectively. Now, the reason why this deck is probably a little bit down is because metal decks have Coating Metal Energy, other decks counter this deck, and it's just not like super well positioned, but it's not unfairly positioned. So this deck's a lower top 10 deck, so anything that's 6 and below, I think it's probably going to hover around there for the next upcoming weeks. But as more and more players either play Psychic or play Rapid Strike Urshifu, this deck's kind of just caught in the middle, and it's not as exciting as the war between the two sides, so it's probably just going to be a little bit lower placed. Now, if we do have a tournament that is best of 3, such as any upcoming GG Tour or Limitless Majors, this deck typically does a lot better. Most Welder decks typically do a lot better in a best of 3 format because they are inherently inconsistent, which makes it an issue to play in a best of 1 event. So that's what we got going on for this deck. Let's see if it can move up a couple spots next week, but before that, let's jump into number 9. Mad Party is another deck that had a really promising last week and fell down, and this deck fell down pretty hard, going from 4th place to 9th place. So you might be wondering, why did that happen? Well, Mad Party probably gained some poor matchups somewhere in the metagame, and it might be because ADP Zacian, which I do find beats Mad Party, continuously dominates. I find the Galaxy Mewtwo deck can win against Mad Party. In fact, it does feel sometimes favorable against Mad Party. Same thing with Pika and Etern being back on the rise. So this is a rift between Rapid Strike Urshifu moving down. Surprise, surprise, it's not going to be our number 1 this week. We'll find out exactly where it places. But if Rapid Strike Urshifu is not at the top, this deck has less good matchups. That invites more bad matchups, and of course puts this deck properly in its position. So Mad Party is really going to be one of those decks that shifts between the lower half of the top 5 to somewhere within the top 10 week in and week out, just depending on how well Rapid Strike Urshifu is positioned in the metagame. And that's really where this deck is clinging on to. Probably won't ever go in front of a Rapid Strike Urshifu, if that makes any sense, because its results directly correlate with Rapid Strike Urshifu existing. So if Mad Party's doing well, Rapid Strike Urshifu probably has to be doing better. If Rapid Strike Urshifu's doing poorly, Mad Party doesn't really have the matchups that it's looking for. How does this deck work? Well, use the Mad Party Pokemon, Bunnelby and Poltegeist to attack for a lot of damage depending on how many Mad Party Pokemon you have in your discard pile. Use cards such as Professor's Research, Quick Ball, Dedenne GX, and Poltegeist to get Mad Party Pokemon in your discard pile, and then you attack with Twin Energy and Triple Acceleration so you can single energy attachment, get some huge knockouts, or line up some VMAXs to get 2-shot. I mean, this deck is, it's good, it's inconsistent in my opinion, and it's one of those things, again, where you need to have some better matchups in the metagame in order for this deck to see success. So again, we're gonna have to see how Rapid Strike Urshifu does next week or this week to really determine exactly where this deck is placed. But I think it's really reliant on that, especially as other top decks like Etern move up the ranks with Rapid Strike Urshifu moving down. Everything kind of has its own reaction. Let's jump into our number 8 spot. Sitting comfortable in our number 8 spot, we got Mewtwo and Mew GX Victini VMAX, and this deck moved up a spot, although 8 and 9 are basically the same slot. Anything within like the lower half of the top 10, so 6 and below, are likely going to stay within the lower half or exit out. They're not going to be shooting up all the way to like number 1, unless of course they're an emerging deck that's come out. This deck has kind of proven itself to be an acceptable deck, and it's more or less a metagame call depending on how things are going. Now, I do like that it has Victini VMAX in the front, which could be a great call depending on how many LMZ and ADP Zacian decks are doing well, and it's got Mewtwo in the front, so it has a decent answer against Psychic type decks like Galaxy Mewtwo or even Rapid Strike Urshifu since it's Psychic weak. And I mean, that's just the deck in an overview. It's not necessarily going to be like this deck can beat Galaxy Mewtwo all the time or this deck can beat Rapid Strike all the time. I think decks that are half and half decks like the Fire and Psychic decks sometimes have an identity crisis because the strategies can be a little bit different. Now, the reason why this deck is probably placed lower, similar to TempoZard, is because it's inconsistent in a best of 1 format because it's reliant off of Welder. So Welder attaching 2 fire energies and drawing 3 cards, I often compare Welder to Hop. Hop's a card that you typically see in a theme deck or a newer player's deck because it's a very basic card teaching the basic fundamentals of the game of drawing cards per turn. Well, Welder attaching 2 fire energies is absolutely amazing, but the draw 3 is what makes the deck inconsistent. And even just acquiring those fire energies in the first place can be a chore at times, even though that Giant Hearth and other things like some decks play Fire Crystal and stuff, it can be very difficult to get those energies in your hand. So I mean, I like how this deck works. You got the Perfection ability on the Mewtwo and Mew GX. You can copy Incineroar, Reshizard, Heatran GX, Charizard GX. I've seen decks play Cramorant so you can snipe your opponent's bench. I like that this deck has tech options. And then you power that up with Welder, or if you're playing against a V or a V Max deck, you can use Max Victory for a lot of damage on the Victini V Max for only 2 energies. So I mean, this deck has a lot of things going for it, but I feel like the deck has a little bit of an identity crisis, which is going to keep it in the lower half of the top 10 for the foreseeable future. And I mean, I've been pretty spot on with this deck for the past few weeks. I guess maybe even a month now. It's been a while. Sometimes a week in the pandemic goes like crazy, but this deck I think is sitting comfortable in its position, and unless there's a serious push for other decks or anything else like that, this deck's probably gonna stay here. So let's jump into our number 7 spot, see exactly what's going on with that. Jumping into our number 7 spot, we have Rapid Strike Urshifu, and I mean, this one's can be surprising to some because it was previously our number 1 spot, falling quite hard to the lower half of the top 10, from being the best deck in format the last week to being like, yo, what's going on here? And I mean, I don't want to be like, I said so, or I told you so, or anything like that. This deck, of course, is the result of getting countered out of the formats. When you're at the top, and it goes for anything in life, there are other people and decks that want to take you down. And this is the case of Rapid Strike Urshifu sitting pretty up there for weeks, because it's brand new, it's shiny. And then if you look out there, there's LucMetal continuously rises up through the formats. ADP Zacian starts adding in text for this deck. Galaxy Mewtwo kind of comes out and plays. Pikachu and PikaRom GX add stealthy hoods. Is also partially a psychic deck. Grass Mewtwo is a Psychic deck. Mewtini is a Psychic deck. Mad Party is a Psychic deck. You can see that, like, where we had a more normalized and stable list weeks ago, we kept on creeping in with more and more Psychic type decks getting added into the format, or decks that just have a strong matchup against Rapid Strike Urshifu, because why would you not target number 1? So our top 10 list might feature inconsistent decks, such as Mad Party, or it might feature other decks that typically don't have the greatest matchup spread, but they're doing really good because they beat Rapid Strike. And then that just means that as more and more players have to play counters, less and less players will just play Rapid Strike Urshifu, because we're just not gaining players here. Rapid Strike Urshifu players are converting into counter players because they're not getting the results that they want with Rapid Strike Urshifu anymore. So this deck's probably going to struggle for the next few weeks as the metagame kind of sorts itself out. But we'll have to see. Maybe it will cling on to a few good matchups. Maybe with all of these decks going out, other popular decks that you could beat, such as Pikachu and PikaRom GX, they might toss those hoods away, or Etern might toss away the weakness guard energies, or it might just see a lot more play in general. So that's how this metagame's kind of shaping up. Now, how does Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX work? You can use Gale Thrust to do 120 plus 30, 150 by switching in from the bench to the active. Make sure that you evolve first on the bench before evolving into the active, because it doesn't count. I've learned that the hard way myself. And then you can use Gmax Rapid Flow to place damage counters effectively on your opponent's Pokemon, just to get a knockout, multi-prize card knockouts and things like that. So efficient attacks, and it's very unclear lines of play, if that makes sense. This deck is not linear. This deck is difficult to pilot. So it could also be a case of a lot of top players just playing around with other decks to explore the metagame as everyone's getting prepared for the Players' Cup keys. This deck has a handful of techs, and I mean, it's proven itself continuously, recently winning the Players' Cup 3 with Azul playing a very similar list to this. So this is what we got going on right now. I think this deck is going to struggle for the next little bit, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it start creeping back up. I don't know if it's going to hit a number 1 spot again. That would make the metagame completely cyclical, and just having to be like a rotation and stuff like that. It's not necessarily going to, I don't think it's going to play out like that. I think we're a little bit more random than that. So we'll see if this deck can continuously move up or move down, but it's definitely going to move. I don't think it's going to stay at number 7 next week. My prediction is it's going to move up a little bit. All right, let's jump into our number 6. We're almost halfway there. Jumping into our number 6 spot, we have Grass, Mewtwo, and Mew GX. Now, this is a deck that we didn't have on our list last week, so for it to go from maybe like a top 15 spots to a top 6 spot is a huge jump. Now, it should also go without saying that a lot of those decks from 15, 14, 13 are not necessarily having the meta share. So I think that this deck is a result of Azul playing it well at the Chill events. And he had a strong performance there playing the deck, and then a lot of people started to kind of jump onto this deck. Now, it's not bad. We've also saw some other top players such as Tord Reklev and Stefan Ivanov that were playing this deck to great success as well. So where does that really mean for this deck? Well, it kind of falls on the line for me that it is another Mewtwo option. As you can see, there's been Mewtwo Victini, there's been just like other options in here. A lot of decks play Mewtwo on this list, and maybe there's going to be a few more. I don't want to ruin anyone's kind of Monday here, but yeah, there's going to be a few more Psychic type decks on this list. So I think being partially a Psychic type deck really helps out. Having energy acceleration sounds really good, and this deck's just going to have the options of Alolan Executor, Rowlet, and I don't know, it's just, you got options to attack with. Maybe you want to attack with a Dragonite GX in this deck instead of attacking with a Trevenant and Dusknoir in a Galaxy Mewtwo setting. This deck has options. This deck can heal. This deck has different matchup spreads. So as this deck continuously moves up or moves down, I mean, this has hovered within the top 10 deck before. So I'd say that this is probably a lower top 10 deck for the foreseeable future if it continuously makes the list. If it doesn't, then it's probably a top 15 deck. So right now, I think that this deck for the foreseeable future is probably going to stay within the top 10. A lot of top players are giving it the thumbs up of approval. This deck, like any other Mewtwo and Mew GX deck, is using Perfection to copy a bunch of attacks, whether they're from in play or in your discard pile. Now, if you are going to run into something like Shadow Box Mimikyu, this deck does not play Stealthy Hood, but you can just turn your deck into a grass deck, so you can attack with Aggro, or you could attack with Buzzmosa, things like that. And Rillaboom does give you an attacking option against decks that might be able to wall you, such as Decidueye. So this deck has a few cute things going for it that other decks just necessarily don't have. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not the most experienced player with this deck. I haven't got a chance to really put my hands on it, but you wanna know what, maybe we'll give this deck a feature on the channel this week and see exactly what's going on with there. And with that being said, let's jump into our number 5 spot to see exactly what's going on with that at the halfway point. Jumping into our number 5 spot, we have Eternatus VMAX. Now, this deck is hopping on up through the top 10 decks, and it's pretty apparent by like everything that I've been saying so far. Basically, Rapid Strike Urshifu's on the trend down. That brings down a bunch of decks, and decks that are going to be coming up are going to counter that deck. Well, the best thing about this deck is the decks that counter Rapid Strike Urshifu typically are good matchups for Eternatus VMAX. Now, this deck still might struggle against LucMetal from time to time, or ADP Zacian with hammers might just give this deck a tough time from using its Dread End. But for the most part, this deck has a typically good matchup spread against most of the top 10 decks, and I think it's probably going to cement itself within a mid kind of spot in the metagame, where it's usually a great deck choice, although there's going to be a handful of decks that like really counter this deck. So if you play against a Rapid Strike Urshifu, that's a really big counter. If you hit a LucMetal and you can't find your Phoebe, that's a really big counter. So how does this deck work? Well, use Eternatus VMAX's Eternal Zone ability to give yourself that boosted bench power. You can have a bunch of dark Pokemon on your bench, up to 8, and then you use Dread End for a lot of damage based off 30 for each Pokemon you have in play. So 9 Pokemon in play, 3 times 9, 270 damage for 2 energies. Now this deck's still packing Crushing Hammers. My thought process in my mind is that there's still enough E-turns that are probably going to come up. It's the only real counter to E-turn. You got other decks like ADP Zacian. You might need the Crushing Hammers to give yourself a little bit of a boost, especially if they're packing Crushing Hammers. And of course, it's just kind of degenerate cards are pretty powerful, let's be honest. So overall, this deck's doing pretty good. Phoebe is obviously good for LucMetal. Now, if LucMetal continuously becomes more of an issue, I could see this deck packing 2 copies of Phoebe, just so you could find it a little bit easier. Although it is one of those things where, I don't know, Phoebe seems to be one of the hardest cards to find when it comes to this deck, especially in my testing. So again, I think I might want to go for a second Phoebe instead of the Pal Pad, but I'm also not sure. Still trying to work on this deck a little bit, and that this deck's probably going to transform week over week to meet the requirements of the metagame. But I think it's going to be positioned at least in the number 5 spots for next week. Maybe it could fall down a little bit, but I think its matchup spread's going to be good as Rapid Strike continuously struggles for the next couple weeks or so. So let's see what deck made into our number 4 spots. Jumping into number 4, we have Pikachu and Zekrom GX. And this deck is kind of the result of it being an extremely neutral deck in the format. So same thing how like E-turn's a neutral deck, I'd say it's like chaotic neutral, whereas ADP is like neutral. PikaRom is like neutral good, if that makes sense. Where it has a decent matchup spread against most decks. It gives you opportunities to outplay your opponents, and there's enough degenerate cards such as Crushing Hammer, Team Yell Grunts, Chaotic Swell, Marnie, and Tandem Shock to really throw your opponent in the blender whenever you need it. And of course, pair that with a reset stamp if absolutely necessary to give your opponent almost no chance of top decking. I find the biggest losses come from Pikachu and Zekrom GX when your opponent top decks or you just miss a few Crushing Hammerheads. Most other times this deck sets up consistently most games, is extremely powerful, and I mean this deck has proved the test of time. This deck coming out at Team Up over 2 years ago, started kicking it off at those international championships, doing a lot of strong placements, all the way to previously where this deck, I won the Players Cup 2 with it, it came second at the Players Cup 3, and I mean, it's one of my top choices going for the Players Cup 4 keys. How does this deck work? Well, you use Bolton V to use Electrify to power up your Pokemon, which could be Pikachu and Zekrom GX or Mewtwo and Mew GX, depending on the matchup. You also have Tapu Koko Prism Star to accelerate that energy, and then you could attack with Full Blitz, powering up other Pokemon. At that point, you really want to sacrifice maybe a Boltund and a Pikachu and Zekrom GX in that particular order, so your opponent has one prize card left to draw. Then you stick them with a Mewtwo and Mew GX, or maybe a Raichu, or maybe a Pika, something that's worth 3 prize cards. Hit them with the Reset Stamp, hit them with the Crushing Hammer, hit them with the Chaotic Swell, and that's really where the deck's gonna go. It just has a lot of really strong capabilities inside, and I think that's what makes this deck so powerful. Really the biggest add into this deck has been Stealthy Hood. Stealthy Hood gives you an option against Shadowbox Mimikyu when you're playing against Rapid Strike. Now as Rapid Strike goes down, maybe Stealthy Hood will be taken out of the deck because Rapid Strike is not as relevant anymore. However, maybe if you do take out Stealthy Hood, that will make Rapid Strike a little bit more relevant and allow it to kind of creep back into the metagame. So Stealthy Hood might be the power over that deck in order to keep it down in the metagame. But right now, I think this deck is really well positioned, especially for Players' Cup keys. Pretty neutral against most decks, so just give it a try if you haven't already. This deck is going to get rotated out though, so it is something to consider if you don't have the cards already. But I think this is a great deck to choose if you're trying to push yourself as a player and grow in skill in general. I think there's a lot of cool things you could do with this deck. So that being said, let's jump into our bronze spot at number 3. Jumping into our number 3 spot, we got Galaxy Mewtwo, and I mean, this deck is similar to Crucephalon, TempoZard, Blacephalon decks. It's kind of had a naming crisis, and I know that there's a group of peeps from the JIT server. They're basically like, this deck is JIT 2. Then there's other peeps where most of the community just calls this deck Galaxy Mewtwo, or Psychic Mewtwo. For the sake of it, I've thought about it long and hard. I don't want to necessarily confuse anyone, so I'm just going to continuously call this deck Galaxy Mewtwo. I know that's not the answer that some of you wanted to hear, but this deck, I'd rather just go with what's known to the public at this time. And if there's absolutely a name change that we need to do in the future based off results or any findings or anything like that, I'm totally down for it. That being said, what does this deck do? Well, Mewtwo and Mew GX gets powered up by Jirachi's Star Surge, and then you can attack with a bunch of cool attacks. Maybe you want to shut off your opponent's GX attack for the rest of the game. Well, maybe you want to go Clear Vision GX then. Maybe you want to stop your opponent completely, grab an extra turn to attach an extra energy. Well, you could use Horror House GX. There's a lot of different attacking options when it comes to this deck. Now, I personally added a Greninja GX because I am worried about Decidueye when it comes to Players' Cup pods. Decidueye is probably a much better choice for pods than most people give off, and I mean, that's probably why we're seeing a large proportion of people playing that deck, or a larger than it being in the top 10 or not being within the top 10. That being said, I think Greninja GX is a great answer to that deck when you're playing this deck. So this deck has a lot of options. This deck's been kicking a lot of decks' butts, and it's become more consistent and powerful than most people ever could give it credit for. So that's the reason why it's moving up. It's just more powerful than we originally thought it was. So a lot of players have been playing this to great success. I mean, this deck is currently one of the reasons why Rapid Strike Urshifu is moving down in the metagame, along with a lot of other Psychic type decks. So will this deck continue to see success? I mean, it consistently does the same things game in, game out. And again, I was a naysayer when it came to this deck. Originally, I just thought that it was just another trend deck, or another trend Mewtwo deck. I mean, you see these chill events and you see Dark Mewtwo do well, or Metal Mewtwo do well, or whatever Mewtwo. This just looked like another one of those Mewtwo decks that was doing well. This deck's the real deal, so I recommend picking up some of the pieces if you don't have them already. Deck is a little bit on the pricey side, so use that discount code at PTCGO store to extend those savings. That being said, I recently covered this deck on the channel, so if you're looking for anything else to know about this deck, feel free to check that out. I did a complete in-depth analysis on this deck. Let's jump into our number 2 pick and see exactly what's going on there. Jumping into our silver spot at number 2, we have ADP Zacian. Now, this deck, similar to Pikachu and Zekrom GX, has been a threat ever since it came out with the Sword and Shield expansion. So that means this deck's been terrorizing us for over a year. And before that, this deck's been crushing it out ever since ADP came out. So it's one of those things where ADP has been one of the strongest Pokemon ever released since it was released. That's not changing anytime soon, and this deck is based off of Andrew Hedrick's deck, if not his exact deck list. So shout out to him for coming up with it. Now, one thing that I do want to note about this deck heading into this week, Crushing Hammers are basically getting taken out of this deck for other counters that directly correlate to the meta, such as Chaotic Swell, or maybe you want to have a Marnie, and then extra consistency cards like Energy Switch and Cherish Ball. So with Crushing Hammers being gone, I would expect E-Turn to be moving up. I expect other decks that get hurt by Crushing Hammers to continuously seek success, but this deck has a lot of techs against some of the other decks. So where Crushing Hammer is still a valuable choice and it's a good option, this deck is probably going to be a little bit more common as more people play this deck. I'm not necessarily sold on one side or the other. I think, again, it's more of a metagame call. I personally like the hammers, although I do see how Andrew probably likes the consistency of this deck a little bit more. Now, how does this deck work? Well, you use Altered Creation GX to draw extra prize cards and do extra damage throughout the game for a metal and a water energy. At that point, you're either getting knocked out or you're not. If you're not getting knocked out, try to target down a Dedenne, Crobat, Eldegoss, anything that's worth 2 prize cards that you can knock out with Ultimate Ray, power up a Zacian, a Mawile, something, just to get yourself set up to do the same thing again the next turn. Zacian V does a lot of damage with Brave Blade, Intrepid Sword's a great way to get set up. Mawile GX brings Pokemon down from your opponent's hand, and this deck is honestly just one of the most degenerate decks available in format because it wins games in about 4 or 5 turns. If it's not winning in 4 or 5 turns, it's likely not winning. But it's a valid strategy. I think it's a really good deck, and I know a lot of people really don't like playing this deck, or they don't like watching this deck. I think that's really one of the biggest mistakes you can make as a player, and that's putting yourself in a box. So if you just give yourself a bunch of rules, you're probably setting yourself up for failure. Because if you're like, oh, I'm not going to touch ADP Zacian, that deck sucks, or that deck's boring, it's been like our top 3 choice for like the past like 5 weeks. So if you're not understanding that by now, it's one of those things, and you might get pissed off at me by just hearing this right now, but I'm just letting people know this deck is basically one of the best decks to play if you're good at sequencing, really good at sequencing. If you don't know what sequencing is, or if you're not great at sequencing, I recommend playing this deck because it's like playing the game with training wheels on. So it allows you to see the success that you want from sequencing, and it really rewards the players who understand how to play cards in the correct order when you're playing them. So I recommend, if you want to practice your sequencing, which is playing cards in the correct order, play this deck because there's not necessarily a lot of options, but those micro decisions can definitely give you a larger win percentage than most. And that's why players like Andrew typically do very well with decks like this. So I recommend giving this deck another try. That's my ADP half rant of the day. But in all seriousness, like, play decks that you want to enjoy, but don't necessarily count out any deck. That being said, ADP Zacian's absolutely busted. I recommend playing this deck in general for anyone of any skill level. Just a very powerful deck that has a pretty good matchup spread at any given event. But what's going to be our number 1 spot? It's not Rapid Strike Urshifu. We already saw that, it seems like a million years ago. What's going to be our new number 1 this week? Jumping in at our number 1 spot, we have LucMetal Zacian. And this deck was previously number 2. It's been seeing a lot of success. And I mean, this deck is one of those decks that's been helping beat down those Rapid Strike Urshifus. Rapid Strike Urshifu has a very difficult time against this deck. And this deck, the best way that I'd ever put it, sure, it gained some better matchup spread when Battle Styles came out. Rapid Strike Urshifu was one of the top contenders. This deck beat it. And of course, there's a few other VMAX decks that this deck would have a powerful chance against beating. Now, I find when I play this deck, and I've given it a strong go, I've learned a lot about this deck. I've been watching a lot of LucMetal content, creating LucMetal content, playtesting this deck in my spare time. This deck seems to reward players who play very correctly, and it seems to punish players who play very poorly. A large portion of players do not know how to play against this deck. If you don't know what you're doing against this deck, I totally recommend playing against this deck, understanding exactly how to play against this deck, and maybe watching some of my YouTube content when I play LucMetal just to try to figure out exactly what the opposite's going on there. Because LucMetal is one of those decks that's probably taking away a large percentage of your wins at these online events. Now, that being said, if you find yourself doing well against LucMetal most of the time, you're probably playing a deck that beats it, understand how to play against it, or you're not playing a deck that loses to it. So even though I know how to play against LucMetal, quite often I'll find myself playing Eternatus or Rapid Strike Urshifu, losing to Josh Sutherland at some of these events. And it's one of those things where sometimes you want to pick a deck that doesn't necessarily lose to this deck, or maybe has a little bit more of an even matchup. So one thing that I'd say is, like, this deck, it just continuously seems to be the default deck. Kind of where ADP Zacian was neutral, this deck is just probably a little bit better right now. I don't know how else to put it. This deck's just very well positioned in this current metagame. There's not a lot of fire decks. The fire decks are getting phased out to the bottom. Even like those half psychic decks, or those half fire decks, half psychic decks, like Mewtini or Mewtwo Welder, are the lower half of the top 10 or not in the top 10. So this deck has Zamazenta V to do well against VMAX decks. You got LucMetal to take away your opponent's energies and ADP and PikaRom and stuff like that, and you have Zacian V as a strong attacker. Similar to Pikachu and Zekrom GX, this deck has a bag of tricks such as Marnie, Power Plant, Chaotic Swell, Metal Goggles, Lily's Pokédoll, to really buy yourself some extra turns. So it's not necessarily as powerful on a turn-by-turn basis, but a lot of things can be, oh yeah, I healed with Malolana, or there's a lot of cool things that you could do with this deck. So if you are looking for a strong deck to play at the Players Cup 4, this is probably going to be one of my top picks going forward. I think it's absolutely amazing, especially when played correctly. And if you just run into a Rapid Strike Urshifu or an Eternatus, there's a good chance you're probably just going to beat them automatically. So having polarizing matchups on top of being a strong deck is best deck in format material. So I could see this deck clearly being number one again, especially if we don't see too many fire decks introduced, but maybe we'll see a handful of decks like Senna Scorch, and I know Victini was very close to being our number 10 spot. So as other fire decks notice that this deck's up top, and maybe they'll see some other matchups, you might see this deck go down a little bit. Like most other number one spots, usually it's that number one for a few weeks or very high up for a few weeks, then it kind of gets taken down by the metagame and crumbles. So that's what we got going on for our number one spot. Let me know if there's any decks that you want me to let you know exactly why they're not placed, why whatever is going on, in the comments below. Otherwise, that's what we got going on for this week, peeps. And that's what we got going on today, peeps. Hopefully you enjoyed watching this video, seeing which decks are crushing it, which decks are tanking right now. Now, there are a handful of decks that did not make it in the top 10. So there's control decks, there's Dragapult Urshifu, Dragapult deck, Spiritomb, Greensard, or Beetle. Those decks typically are just not as performing as strongly as these decks in the top 10. So I'm going to choose the decks that are performing the best in tournaments over those things. This one was all mathematically based. I agreed with it. Everything makes a lot of sense when it comes to this top 10 deck. So that being said, we'll see exactly how it goes for next week. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I get back to them as soon as possible. And again, if you haven't subscribed already, hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like to signal boost it to the masses of Pokemon players. And then we'll see exactly what's going on for next week. Have yourself a great one. Peace out. I want to give a huge shout out to everyone who's become a channel member so far. Some peeps love watching my videos, and I totally appreciate that, but some peeps have gone more than out of their way beyond just watching my videos and have supported me financially. So shout out to everyone who's been featured on this channel, who's going through this list of names. We actually have so many channel members that I can't fit them in a single slide, so I figured this might be the best way to get everyone appreciated and kind of showcase all of the top supporters of the Zacian PTCG YouTube channel. Seriously, it means I mean it from the bottom of my heart. It's honestly, I'm almost at a loss for words, but I'm so happy that you are all appreciating and loving the content and that it's hitting home. And I mean, I'm up all in my feels, so I hope that you understand. And thank you so much, everyone. If you want to become a channel member, totally consider it. I'll make it worth your while. And I totally mean that. I'll do everything I possibly can for my channel members to make it sure that it's worth their while. So thank you so much, everyone. And it's just amazing. Thank you. For everyone who's wondering on how to become a channel member, I first and foremost appreciate your consideration. You can click on any one of my videos on desktop, and then you can click join. Join will give you all the opportunities about what we have going on. You can support my content. You could choose the deck list hookup, where you get access to my deck list, and we have a group coaching package as well. There's a lot of other things like custom emotes, early access to videos that I try to offer. So you would just click join and you'd be good and you'd be featured at the end of these videos. Thanks so much everyone. So much for watching and supporting the channel. If you haven't already, it'd mean the world to me if you could subscribe to help support me as a content creator. Thanks again and have yourself a great one.